shout on, pray on, we're gaining ground. Glory, hallelujah, the dead's alive and the lost is found. Glory, hallelujah.
Welcome to Let's Talk Eschatology, where we bring in various guests to discuss how theology and eschatology shapes our lives. We have a great guest for today's episode, but before diving in, I have a question for you. Do you want to start reading the Puritans but don't know where to start? Puritan Treasures for Today from Reformation Heritage Books makes the riches of these godly writers of old accessible for the modern reader. With updated language and helpful introductions, these classic works from John Owen, Jeremiah Burroughs, and more are the perfect starting point for the curious reader. Learn more about the Puritan Treasures for Today at heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. Enter promo code EMatters for 10% off your whole order. Well, our guest for today's episode is Marcus Pittman. He is a filmmaker, an executive producer, and CEO of LOOR. That is a streaming service where you can fund and watch exclusive crowd-funded stories that Hollywood doesn't want you to see. Marcus, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Marcus, I gave a little bit of an intro about who you are, but if you want people to know kind of what have you done, what interests you, what excites you, what kind of brought you into the kind of whole industry around film and art and that sort of world.
Yeah, I've been in the Christian film industry for a while, way back. I worked briefly with Todd Friel of Wretched back then on that show, and then got to meet, became really good friends with Chocolate Knox, who's now doing a course Cross Politic with Doug Wilson. And then before he moved to Moscow, we were doing stuff together. And then he moved out there, and then I went out to Phoenix and I worked with Jeff Durbin and built up Apologia Studios. So we built that up pretty high, that YouTube channel. Back when you could build up YouTube channels without, suppression of controversial narratives. So we kind of got in right in time for that, prior to the 2016 sort of Trump being
Yeah.
elected, and when everything started to shut down, especially even more so 2020. But yeah, so that happened. Did that, and then I got basically was looking for a part-time job, applied for this gig, and it turned out to be the ad agency that did all of PureFlix's advertising.
Okay.
Um, and they actually offered me a full-time gig and created a job for me at this organization, to basically run lead for all the PureFlix ads and stuff like that, video content. So left Apologia to do that for about a year, and just got really fed up with, movies for 65-year-old women and nursing home patients, and went back and did a movie with Apologia called Babies Are Still Murdered Here. Spent a year working on one movie. That was my job. And we put that on Amazon Prime, and Amazon Prime deleted it.
Oh, wow.
And so uh, that's when I realized, okay, like, you're not going to get good movies from the PureFlix people, because they're just not focused on any audience older than 65-year-old woman, younger than the 65-year-old woman. And then I thought, well, there's just this massive distribution problem with conservative and faith-based films. And that's where the idea of lore came from. It was just the idea of, the two biggest problems filmmakers have is funding and distribution. And so we just put that together as one platform, and monthly subscribers subscribe to lore. And every week they get to spend their monthly subscription funding movies and TV shows. And we just really wanted to create, I think it was interesting because at first we were like, yeah, we're going to come after Netflix and, chop off the giant's head and all this sort of stuff. But as we started to really study and get to speak to artists and really sort of have very high level conversations with executives of other streaming platforms and TV networks and all that sort of stuff, we just realized that everybody was going towards this we're going to compete with Netflix mentality. And we just realized, and I think our eschatology helped out a lot with this, is just you don't defeat enemies with big armies, but you do it over the long haul. And then you start to read, I've read, I'll name some books if anybody's interested. But you read, like I Want My MTV is phenomenal. It's an oral history of how MTV got started. Tinderbox is a great book on the history of HBO. A lot of inappropriate, all these guys are not Christian. These are
Yeah, with
not
all the
Christian
appropriate
books.
caveats for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're not theology books. But if you look at what's it, MTV, HBO, uh, there's a really great book called "Homie Don't Play That," the behind the scenes of In Living Color.
Mhm.
So basically, and there's several others. Food Network has a book. I think it's called like Secret Recipe or something like that. But basically, you just start reading how all these major billion-dollar cable brands got started, and there's one demonstrable, inarguable theme, and that's they all started with low money, and they focused on artists who they gave incredible amounts of freedom to because they didn't have money. And then each book shows that as they got more money and they became bigger and more mainstream, they got purchased by corporations. They all lost their identity. And so moving that up to streaming now, we have like Paramount Plus, right? So Paramount Plus
Yeah.
has CBS, and under that you have Comedy Central and Nickelodeon and MTV, like all these other channels under Paramount Plus. And they've eliminated um all the iconic brand identity that they've built up. They've just eliminated it. And it's these smaller niche streaming brands that have built these sort of national media companies. And so what we have is a problem in Christianity where we think the bigger the army, the better we're gonna defeat our enemies. But that's just not how God works. That's just not how history works. And we're in a very long term battle where small armies rise up and become and defeat their enemies. So you see it with David and Goliath and Gideon, and you know, you know, just throughout all of scripture, it's the weakest that wins. And so we're now focusing on really just creating this independent punk rock art house for conservative films to be experimental, low budget content, that sort of thing, shorts, and that sort of idea, with the idea of uh, artists starting out and developing a name for themselves and then moving on to bigger and better things. And that is the classic, uh, repeatable and scalable observation through television and media history that you see is what wins the
Yeah.
day.
Yeah. So
And
I think
so,
good.
yeah, go ahead. No, that's it. Yeah.
I was going to say, right, you have a pretty bold and ambitious goal to go after media, right? I think a lot of Christians speak about and, bemoan the ills of society and kind of place a lot of the emphasis on media being where that is all being, capitulated and being promoted and being indoctrinated into people's lives. And you mentioned this idea, I think, I think there's really two conversations that I would love to dive into for this episode. One would be is how do you actually win? And you've alluded to that, this idea of like, okay, we're not going to win just by one big swoop. It's probably going to be over time slowly. And then
Right.
the other conversation is, well, I think Doug Wilson's famous for this line, to win a culture war, you have to have a culture, right? So to
Yes.
win an art war and a media war, we have to have art and media. And what does the Christian art and media look like? And how is it any different than Hallmark movies, kind of like the Pureflix model, right?
Right.
And so kind of what do you think would be the first, like a better starting point, the kind of how do you win, or what weapons do we use to win?
Well, I think we should probably start with first off, like what does Christian culture look like? I think that something we don't think about a lot. If I were to say what sort of Christian culture do we have now in this country? We don't really have it. Not like we used to.
Yeah.
So if you go back to the 90s, we had Veggie Tales, we had Adventures in Odyssey. I have a hat back here. I can't get it, but you can see it behind the headphones, a little blue and white hat back there
Hmm.
beside my manga hat. But that's a Gerbert, right? That was given to me by Chris Christensen, who was the creator of that show.
Hmm.
But it was, like, so we had all these pop culture, like we had our own distinct culture. A lot of this was because we had really solid distribution, and that was through Lifeway Christian bookstores, right?
Yeah.
So we were able to create entertainment and then distribute it through our own channels. And of course, a lot of that, because Lifeway was for the 35-year-old soccer mom, that's the main audience of Lifeway. All of our Christian media became feminized as a result of that, right? So, that's how you get the Beth Moores, right? You get, the effeminate Russell Moores, right? Like
Yeah.
just all these people, their media is for that female audience. So you just, but on the good side of it, it also got us a lot of great kids content, right? So people my age grew up, I worked at Chuck E. Cheese for like 3 years when I was in high school. And they would play Veggie Tales on this TV screens. They had a license deal for Veggie Tales inside Chuck E. Cheese. So we like our culture was mainstream. Like it was broad. I mean, you could get because I remember you could buy cassette tapes for Adventures in Odyssey
Yeah.
as part of your Chick-fil-A kids meal. Yeah, right. So there was this really, I don't think people realize how broad. We look back on it and God, it was so cheesy, right?
Yeah.
And everything was so, but it was broad and mainstream, and it was ours, and we had it, and uh, you know, VeggieTales is probably, if we're, I mean, it's probably not anymore, but it was probably at least one time close to $1 billion property. And it's still a valuable IP. Right. So we had these things, but it all got cannibalized by other means, whether that's, Lifeway being cannibalized by Amazon, or our movies and film industry being taken over by Netflix. And then, from there you get, your God's Not Dead and your Pureflix, which we can have that conversation too but it all came from the Lifeway Christian bookstores. And so the thing is now, because we don't have Lifeway Christian bookstores, those shut down in 2000. I think a year actually before COVID, all of them shut down in 2019. I think all the Lifeway bookstores shut down. And when that happened, they didn't build up any alternative distribution methods prior to shutting that down. So immediately Christian culture was just gone. And then the only thing we had left was, well, maybe Netflix will share our stories, which they didn't. They don't care. And then so then all we had was PureFlix, really was our own main online distribution sort of thing. Um, and then PureFlix's target demographic was like 55-year-old women and above, right? So
Yeah.
basically all the 35-year-old shopping moms, soccer moms that were shopping at Lifeway now have gotten older, and they're in their 50s and 60s, and they're not 35 anymore. And so they're getting PureFlix subscriptions. And so now you just have this massive area. And so meanwhile, younger men, teenagers, older men are just completely neglected in the faith-based space. They always were because of Lifeway, but now there's just no way to, like, there's no contact points at
Well, one
all.
thing that I think is like coming up, right? Is so one you talk to me, it's a little bit of like there's traditional distribution centers, right, of like media. so like cable or something like that, and maybe try to get on like the local channel 3 or something like that with that kind of stuff. Then you had the Lifeway. I actually worked at a Lifeway during grad school in Wheaton out there. So I totally saw exactly what you're talking about with the type of culture that was having. So the thing that see happening right now in our culture is a switch to more, I don't know how to describe it, like personalized or bespoke, where there's all these separate like YouTube channels, I think are becoming like a big place. A lot of people are going for media,
Hmm.
like streaming services. Not only are there Netflix, but the Shutter for horror fans,
Yep.
Crunchyroll for anime, right? There's all these
Yes.
different unique streaming services. Then Daily Wire being kind of like a large conservative that started
Yep.
doing their own, and they're doing movies. And it seems like there isn't any like marketplace anymore. As in, like, here's the one place I go, like cable, where there's a whole bundle and I get many different things. It's kind of like I
Mhm.
have to buy every separate channel, right?
Yeah.
So do you think that is a kind of, is that the path that we as Christians need to go? I know LOOR is kind of like positioning themselves in that, or do you think no, we need to try to build an institution again?
Well, I think we look at cable and we say, well, that's our one marketplace, but that was a monopoly,
Hmm.
right? So you really didn't have a choice per se in what cable channels you got. Like people were always requesting, a bespoke cable channel service
Yeah, yeah,
where
that's
if
good.
I only wanted 5 channels, I could get 5 channels. I could get Cartoon Network and my local channels, but you were never able to do that except for like HBO pay-per-view. Like
Yeah.
that was sort of the only bespoke stuff that you had. So, but I think uh, so I think the I'm only going to get my streaming subscription to, let's say, Netflix and YouTube TV or whatever, like I decide. That's it's much better for the consumer now. It really is.
Hmm.
It seems like it's not, because everything they put out is so miserable, right? But I think what's going to happen, I think you mentioned it perfectly, is like Crunchyroll, Shutter. You have these more niche cable, I call them cable TV channel, cable streaming is
Sure, sure.
basically
No,
the
I
way,
get you. Yeah.
right? And so, it's just like you had Cartoon Network and Food Network, and you right. So you just had these entire sort of niche streaming channels. So the problem with Christians is we don't see a value. If we say, hey, we're just going to start this little Food Network channel, and it's going to be a streaming platform, and it's just going to focus on food and recipes exactly like Food Network does, but it's going to be a new version.
Yeah.
And if I were to pitch that to Christians, they would go, "Well, where's the gospel message going to be?" And
Yeah.
you go, "Well, I mean, it's about eating,
Yeah.
like that's so central, and women preparing recipes for their family. The husband comes home, and like there's all this gospel that's wrapped up
And
into that."
I think that's a trap a lot of Christians get into with media, right? Is
Right.
there's two things that they get trapped with. The first one is I need it, if it's going to be Christian, then I need it to be explicitly gospel, and therefore it like sucks the
Yeah, it's
actual
got to be
content.
special revelation.
Right, exactly, right. You can't do natural revelation. I'm reading Joe Rigney's, I guess, listening to the audiobook of Joe Rigney's um, book on the idea of like the things of this world, right? Growing dim, but he says growing bright, and just the importance of enjoying the natural world that God created for us. And
Yeah.
I think Christians, when it comes to art, say, well, if there is an explicit gospel, that's why PureFlix model of just kind of like, here's a story. The story is not the important part. It's the moment at the end of God's not dead where it says text someone, text 5 people in your family that God's not dead, right?
Right.
And I remember I was hanging out with my buddy, and he gets a text from his mom just randomly. It's all caps, God's not dead. And he's like, okay, yes, he's not, and he's so confused. And him and I went to see the movie in the movie theater just to like, what's this all about? And then we see at the very end of it, and we're like, oh, okay. And there's either has to be that explicit, like this is about the gospel, this is to share the gospel,
Yeah.
or if they want art, they actually like turn their brain off to Christianity and say like, oh, I just rather have like the big institution of Food Network
Yeah.
or the big
Yeah.
institution.
Christians don't mind going to see a Marvel movie,
100%. Yeah.
right? They like that's probably a majority target demographic of Marvel films are conservative, male men
Yeah.
in faith-based families that go out and see that stuff. But if a Christian were to say, hey, I'm just going to make a Marvel movie,
Hmm.
I'm going to, I just signed this big deal for Disney and I'm not going to make God's Not Dead movies anymore. I'm working on the next Spider-Man. We go, oh, he abandoned the faith. Right?
Yeah.
I think that's how it was. I've alluded to this before, like, and there's a lot of issues with Lecrae. But there was this moment when Lecrae was trying to figure out. I don't think he had like a post-mill eschatology to be able to articulate properly what he was trying to do. And but I think there was this time when he said, I don't want to be a Christian hip hop artist anymore. I want to compete with Jay-Z and everybody else on the same shelf.
Yeah.
And what he was really retaliating against wasn't Christianity, but he was trying to get outside of the K-Love Lifeway distribution.
Dove,
Uh,
like music awards and
yeah,
all that
that
stuff.
he wanted to get out of that and just compete as a normal artist with everybody else. But it was immediately just he's abandoning the faith, and then the church turned on him and all this sort of stuff. And I think, I think that sort of reaction that we had to him doing that, and I think I wasn't as knowledgeable as I am now, and it's probably, you know, against what he was doing. But looking back on it, I think we pushed him out, and pushing him out instead of saying, yeah, do it, go do it, take dominion over the entire music industry. You don't have to
Yeah.
be on Lifeway. But instead of us doing that, we basically forced him into being embraced by the woke nonsense. And, it's sort of like our judgment is kind of
Yeah.
responsible
So
for.
how do we create that kind of robust Christianity then that
Yeah.
is able to embrace art for the sake of saying this is good and beauty glorifies God?
You have to offend people. I think, you have to just let filmmakers make whatever they want, and you can't restrain them too much. So at Lore, our focus is on giving filmmakers freedom. And so usually when we say that, people get all afraid and they're going to push like woke stuff, or they're going to have nudity in their films, and, all this sort of vulgar content. But what we've spoken to a lot of Christian filmmakers, a lot of people that work in very high levels of Hollywood, and they don't want to do that stuff. They just want to make normal stories. And so the push on them in the Hollywood industry, you know, you know, most actors don't want an intimacy coordinator to do sex scenes. That's pushed on them from the top down from Hollywood executives. If you give a majority of most artists, if you give them freedom, they're gonna make a normal story that you're probably going to enjoy. They might cross the line a little bit. They might have adult language that you don't not necessarily a fan of, but they're for sure not going to make anything that's contrary to the faith, in terms of the overall narrative and stuff. Most of them, they just want to make a movie where a masculine man rescues a feminine woman. And they can't do that in Hollywood. And they can't do that in the faith-based world, because that would require, violence and stuff that the faith-based world tries to shy away from.
Yeah.
And so I think the main thing you need to do is you need to figure out a way to monetize artist freedom, so that they can make money making the kind of content they want. And you have to trust the artists. That's hard to do. I can't tell you how many people have not invested in lore because we don't have strict content guidelines, or other streaming platforms that have boards of directors and pastors who are making sure that the films are appropriate. Well,
Yeah.
those are two separate roles. The church is not the institution of art,
Yeah.
right? Like there's a sphere of sovereignty thing here. And art really is more in the family business sphere than it is the church sphere,
What
although the church should encourage it. But because we've only had PureFlix, which has said, hey, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go to the pastors, and instead of marketing towards individuals to come out and watch the movie. We're just going to market to pastors to buy tickets to the whole theater. And then that way, it doesn't matter if the movie's good or not, it still sells out theaters. And they can just give away free tickets if people want to come. And that's how you get, you know, movies like God's Not Dead doing so well. But if you go and see that the theaters are kind of empty, it's because,
Yeah.
they were, pastors were outside of the hotel, outside of the theater lobby, just passing out free
Well,
tickets.
I've noticed this type of like Christian engagement with art, and I wonder. I've noticed this in like churches in general. There is a love for like Paul's letters and Ephesians and Romans and all those epistles, and there's less of love of the narratives of the Bible. And I wonder if that's
Yeah.
because Christians have grown to disdain narrative because there's a looseness of it, right? There is a like subtle meaning where I have to kind of read into the narrative to understand its point
Right.
rather than saying like do this, don't do this, this is true, this is bad. Where when I read a story about David and Bathsheba, I'm having to like think through the moral implications. It doesn't say David's an evil person and he did this. It's like, well, David's the man of God's own heart, or that after God's own heart, and
Yeah.
yet he still has this great sin. And narrative allows those tensions to play, and I think a lot of Christians aren't comfortable with that, and maybe that's why they like the art that is so heavy-handed.
Yeah. Well, I think, part of this, I think we can blame on the reformed seminary culture, and all the organizations that spawn out of that. So the very high level intellectual sort of stuff like, even like early, like the Gospel Coalition, even before they went crazy, the Gospel Coalition, you can probably even put like, you know, hate to say it, but like Master Seminary, Ligonier, all, like they're very academic and education oriented, and they're not focused on arts, and it's like, we see a you see a poem, poetry and scripture, and it's like, well, is this literal or is it, like, and the idea was like, oh yeah, well, it's literal interpretation. The Bible is literal. We have to take the poetry literally. And so, that's more on the dispensational side for sure
Yeah,
than, I wasn't throwing Ligonier in there, but uh so uh so there's this idea of like, just we've lost the ability to be able to like uh look at a story and say, what is the author trying to articulate by that character's actions, on our own.
yeah,
And so that, and a lot of that's just abandonment of, classical education. A lot of the seminaries aren't based on classical education. And so you have seminaries, and then you have conservative talk radio, and you have Fox News, and everything in our world is very analytical and facts and data driven. And we have nothing that's just, we've forgotten the importance of dumb cartoons where coyotes try to kill Roadrunner, right? Like there's no real moral of that. uh, you know, uh, and it's like, what's the moral of Coyote and Roadrunner? Is Coyote's technically a good guy? He's just trying to eat, right? Roadrunner's, just trying to protect his life. There's no good and evil in that. It's just a dumb cartoon. And same thing with like Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd. Well, Elmer Fudd's not the bad guy; he's a hunter. Like that's what we do, right? Right. So like the lines of morality aren't there, because the goal of it isn't to teach you a lesson. It's just so you and your kids can sit on the couch and laugh together and enjoy a good time watching a cartoon. Like that's the value and beauty of like Looney Tunes cartoons. And we don't have that in conservative narrative storytelling. All of our conservative films, like just look at what's coming out right now. You have, the last three films Angel did are probably all biopics based on supposedly true stories. And then, you have Bonhoeffer coming out this fall, right? So everything is biopics. And it's like, you know, why? can't we just have normal movies?
Yeah.
Why does it like do conservatives only go watch movies if they're based on true stories? It's no, they
Yeah.
don't. But for some reason we can't get out of that sort of idea that biopics are the main thing.
I
Uh
think there is this like tension that a lot of Christians have is I don't think they have a like third sphere in their mind. There's almost like there's the church sphere I live and the secular sphere, which is and what they mean by that is fully divorced from God, and then
yeah,
this is God. And so when Christians say, "Hey, I want to create art," I don't think they understand. Oh, something secular can still be God glorifying, right? They
right.
say the only way it could be God glorifying if it's fully in the sphere of like the church and ministry and preaching, right? Because that's the sphere of God. But the sphere of secular, oh, well, you're not a Christian, then you're just a filmmaker, right? Why are you trying to act as though Christianity has anything to do with this secular art form?
Yeah.
And so to me, when you're talking about all these things, like um, the Roadrunner, or you're talking about I even think about like great art. Like, so I love Christopher Nolan, right? I watch all of his movies. It's a joke around my friends, like how much I get obsessed with like it, and obviously is phenomenal filmmaker, great scenes. But those movies get me to talk about things, right? Whether it's
No.
like Interstellar, where clearly one of the main themes is the father's love for his daughter, which saves the like universe, pretty like humanity, right? And he's driven by that or something like. But to have those type of moments, right? How do we help kind of Christians see that if it could be Christian but not like preaching? Like,
Yeah, I
what does it mean to glorify God outside of preaching?
the best way I describe it is, you know, God made the heavens and the earth and the stars and the sky and creatures and nature and all this amazing, wonderful art. But in Romans 1, it says that it wasn't enough to say it's not enough to save anybody, right? It's
Hmm.
just general revelation. And so when it comes to Christian art, we think, oh no, our art has to be special revelation.
Mm.
And it's like, why? God's most beautiful work is not I mean, the scripture is probably the most beautiful work, is special revelation, but just of all the everything else is uh is just, it's a leaf and a flower. It doesn't, you're not going to get saved by smelling a rose. Right? But you might praise God because you smelled a rose,
Yeah.
right? And so like that's the problem we have. And I don't know how my assumption is, if I say, well, how do we get in that problem? I think it's because we realized back in the early 2000s that we could just make movies that pastors will buy the tickets for. So as long as they're evangelistic, we don't have to really compete in a fair market
Yeah.
for our storytelling. We can just have one pastor spend the church money to buy 300 tickets, um, and pass them out as they want. And then Variety goes, "Wow, look at how well, God's Not Dead did in the box office. They sold out theaters all over the country." Um, and that's not exactly true,
Hmm.
because it wasn't individuals that bought
Yeah. Yeah.
tickets and people weren't lining up out the door to sold out, seats at God's Not Dead. The tickets were handed out by pastors standing outside the hotel, standing outside the theater. So that's that I think that so damaged in people's minds what Christian entertainment is, that it's very hard to get out of that. So much so, you know, uh, we've sort of sanctified films more than they should be too. So we have this massive cancel culture problem, where if there's anything that offends us, we want to just get rid of the entire institution, right? Or this artist said made this thing and I don't agree with it, so we got to burn the whole thing down. A great example of this recently is the NSA ad with the middle finger, right? The Johnny
Yeah.
Cash finger. And the line before it was, we're looking for students that'll hoist the Jolly Roger and not be afraid to throw up Johnny Cash's middle finger at idolatry.
Yeah.
And we weren't able to think critically. No one was able to really think critically about what was being said there. And we all got mad at the middle finger reference, but not the Jolly Roger reference, which is, like NSA wasn't looking for students that want to rape and pillage and steal.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's exactly what pirates do. But it's talking about more of a mindset, not necessarily actually taking the middle finger at individuals, because the
Yeah.
line didn't even say individuals. It
Yeah.
said at idolatry.
Well, even if we
Right?
even think about like Elijah, like a person who like gives no like I mean, there's a famous quote that are all like these guys say about Narnia, about the Narnians when they go into the Kellerman village, and they say who don't they have this aura of joy, right? Where they be friends with anyone who's friendly and not give a fig about anyone else. Right, the concept
Right.
of not giving a fig, like it's not hard to guess, like where that's kind of
Yeah.
like the same type of
Right.
thing. But the idea is like
Right.
Christians, we should be so like content in our identity in Christ as Christians that when people try to push against us, we laugh and we mock that, right? And I think
Right.
your point's right. Is like when we're saying the Jolly Roger, we're not saying literally become like Somali pirates and like capture and kill and steal, right?
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
saying
And
to
no,
like
and
to
nobody was able to take that NSA ad and justify what Ezekiel said about the prostitutes and the horses and right, like
yeah,
right, like nobody would have that conversation, because I remember reading all the comments and people were asking, well, what about Ezekiel? And the response was, well, you're not a prophet.
yeah, you're not Ezekiel.
Yeah, you're not Ezekiel. And
But that's
it's
the problem
like,
with narratives, I think, a little bit, where like if you're like, oh well, you're not David, you're not Ezekiel, like, but isn't the point of a story is to try to elevate you to be, like see
well,
like an example?
that was Matt Chandler's post. You're not
Yeah,
David, right?
yeah,
It's like, well, yeah, no, yes, you are.
right, yeah,
Like that's the point. Like God uses men like David and you to defeat enemies. Like that is we should see ourselves in David. We're we're rapists and adulterers and murderers and all of Ray Comfort's stuff. And
yeah,
right, and so just like David was, but also if we have faith, we really can destroy giants and take out armies, and Christians should be thinking in those categories. But we have this idea of, oh, you're not David, and it's like, oh, you're not a prophet. It's like, yeah, but the point is, if the sort of language in Ezekiel 23, if I were to come out and say that,
yeah,
uh, and you would say, well, you're wrong for saying that. You have to figure out how God's law is not immutable and unchanging for all people, and you just made the special exemption, this special clause for Ezekiel, or Elijah or Ezekiel. Like you have to, you have to basically say God's law changes based on people throughout all times. So it either was a sin for him to use that language, or it wasn't. That's the only two options there.
yeah. No, 100%. And I think the purpose of a story is to elevate you and usually use like fantastical situations, right? Usually the
Yeah.
classic story is like the normal world, the hero is thrust into a new world, right? The whole like hero's journey, right? And then has to like rise to it. Harry Potter is famous, and a more modern one. Lord of the Rings with the hobbits are very much this story, right? And I think in a lot of ways, to see our situation with new lens. That's kind of like Lewis's kind of whole point of with young people, how do I read the day, right? What like when I say like, oh yeah, there's Goliaths we need to conquer. I need to chop off the head of Goliath. We're not talking about literally taking swords and chopping heads off, but what does it that fight actually look like? And I think stories help you use metaphorical language that you could then apply in real time to your actual situation, right? As you're looking at the world that we live in. And I think a lot of Christians are waking up to that this Christian dominant Western world seems to be slipping from us. And
Yeah.
so I think the, you know, kind of Lifeway, PureFlix model of, hey, just you need a nice Hallmark warm story. A lot of
Yeah.
Christians are realizing that story no longer is that helpful.
No.
When we feel like we're in an actual war. We need stories
Yeah.
like David and Goliath. We need these
Yeah.
kind of bigger type of stories.
Yeah. You literally have, we live in a world where the CIA is, planning agents with inside the church, and the feds are planning agents with inside the church and organizations and stuff like that. And we're like, well, we just need to be nice.
Yeah.
All right. It's like, no, like guys, we're in like a really deep battle, uh, really against the highest level of demonic people, you could possibly imagine, whether that's Soros or Bill Gates or that sort of thing, and we're just like, oh no, we just got to be nice and, just, share the gospel and that way it's like it's not just about sharing the gospel, like that's not a full orbed life of a Christian. They share the gospel and then they slay dragons at the same time. You can do
Yeah.
both. And we need movies and stories specifically for men that encourage them to be warriors and to battle and to fight. When you look at like I think a good example of this, I had a conversation with a guy who was in the military. And he said that if it wasn't for cartoons like G.I. Joe and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and all these war movies him and his
Yeah.
mom would watch, when 9/11 happened, he wouldn't have joined the military. But it was those stories that he watched as a kid that gave him the courage to go out and fight like that. And so we need stories for our men that are not uh demeaning towards men. Like I say that in the way like fireproof and courageous, where they're called fix him ups,
Hmm.
where they're made for women to bring their husbands to get fixed at the theater. And so like that, those are not the kind of stories we need. We need stories where the men are heroes,
Yeah.
and they're able to fight and they risk their lives. And that's the difference between feminine stories and masculine stories, right? Feminine stories, the problems are always emotional and relational. Those are always the biggest dangers. And with a masculine story, the problems are always outside of the man, whether they're legitimate enemies, bad guys, villains, and they have to risk their lives to save their family. There's death is always an option and on the table. Like
Yeah.
that's a lot different than a Lifetime rom-com movie,
Yeah. Well, it's
where
interesting.
it's
Yeah. Good.
yeah, I mean, I was just gonna say like Lifetime rom-com movies where, it's whether or not, the woman is, her biggest challenge is, do I leave my successful job,
Yeah.
and go with this man, who's perfect in every way, right? Like
Yeah.
that's every Lifetime, and that's the model we've copied Christian films off of because we saw that it was working with women, and we had Lifeway Christian bookstores, so obviously that was the smartest business plan, was to make that those sort of content for those kind of people. But and we've completely neglected men in the process.
And
And
I
now
think, yeah. And I think with art, good.
I was just gonna say now all our movies are gay.
Yeah.
So
Right. And so I feel like quite literally, right, the whole goal is to like desexualize and like androgynize like men, right? There's a great quote about like, the dangers of porn is that it makes women like men, and dangers of like romance stories is that it makes men like women, right? And
right,
I think this was Tim Challies in his blog like many, many years ago. And I always thought that insight was so correct, is that we need stories that promote the masculinity of men and the femininity of women, and it shows that hey, God's honored even in these natural things, right?
right.
I do want to kind of get into kind of one last point before we get close to wrapping up. Uh, as we look at art and we think about um, the stories that we have, um, one of the things I think that we run into is, well, how do we actually um, win in culture, right? You have Marvel, which is such a dominant story, but to be honest, I think that story is meant to actually like uh, weaken you, because I think it's meant to make you a spectator of these things. Like these are unique superheroes, and they even make these superheroes, I think, flawed. That's like such a big theme nowadays. I think
That
purpose, like,
was what made Marvel famous, is the superheroes were flawed.
yeah, right. That's what I
The
was saying,
DC
right?
the DC superheroes, like you had Spider-Man, it was basically a Jesus Christ figure,
Yeah.
literally, like that was modeled off of the Old Testament Messiah
Oh,
into
interesting.
Jesus.
Okay.
It's like they didn't believe in Jesus, but they wrote Superman and they put all this Christ figure sort of stuff. He was sent from another
Yeah, yeah,
planet
yeah.
and
Okay.
you know, so yeah, so yeah, but sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, your point.
Right. So I guess, yeah, maybe the whole superhero could be another whole conversation. I guess I was going more so about like just this size and scale, though, right? Of like Marvel and Disney and a level of, I think there's Christians who say, we're not going to win fighting that media war. Let's just keep watching our Marvel movies. We could focus on our little like preaching like stories here. So how does something like lore and what you're trying to do, what does it actually look like to be victorious? And maybe this gets into a little bit of your eschatology about I don't expect to win. Hollywood wasn't built in a day, I think the website says, nor is it going to be defeated in a day. And maybe dive into a little bit of your motivations there.
Um, when I think of like what does it look like when Lore wins, I look back on like MTV, right? And they had basically they've defined pretty much Gen X as the MTV generation. So you have a whole generation of people that were defined by a cultural media brand. And I think, that is what I would like to see. I would like to see lore artists making content that you can go to Walmart or to the toy store and there's items outside of the movie and film itself that people are buying, whether it's, barely biblical figures on lunchboxes or kids walking down the mall with t-shirts of lore IP on, and just know that there's like, because that's when you really break into a level of cultural significance that you provide. That's really where the value is. Um, you know, when if I were to say, hey, we're gonna make this movie Sound of Freedom, right? Angel did Sound of Freedom. It did really well,
Yeah.
probably over $100 million in the box office or whatever. They got lucky on timing and the current news, state of news and affairs and stuff like that. But now, like nobody remembers them. Like you, right? Like nobody remembers that movie. They just did Sound of Hope, that flopped in the box office. I believe it flopped. And they tried to, change the name of the movie to capitalize off of Sound of Freedom, and nobody really cared because those movies don't have any cultural relevance outside of the moment in time people are watching it,
Hmm.
and then they're quickly forgotten. Whereas something like Disney or Marvel, before you even get to the Disney and Marvel we have today, we have 100 years of comic books and Disney characters that have built that over the course of 100 years.
Yeah.
So it's not possible. This is a demonstrable fact. It's completely provable. It's repeatable. It happens time after time again. And it is you cannot buy a box office breakout hit. You cannot have a box. You cannot buy a blockbuster. That's what we say at Lore all the time. You can't buy a blockbuster. You have to build a blockbuster through time. And Hollywood hasn't done that. They haven't invested money, they haven't invested resources. They've bought Marvel, they've bought all these other sort of organizations and old IP. And now, I think next year, I think there's only like two original movies that aren't sequels or remakes coming out in
Yeah.
theater next year. Only two, right? And so, what we have to do is we have to figure out ways to make new IP, and invest in new IP. And you don't invest in new IP by fronting $100 million for one movie. You invest in new IP by spending spending $10 million on 10 movies. That's what you have to do. And uh, streaming is perfect for that. But nobody wants to do that. Like everybody still wants the movie to go to the box office and to make money that way, as opposed to looking at something like Stranger Things, where Stranger Things was so popular, Netflix had to start their own merch company, right? Because people were demanding Stranger Things
Yeah.
merchandise. And they didn't have that, and so they had to build that. And so that's where you get your long tail revenue and streams and stuff like that. But that's not going to happen through a Kendrick Brothers movie. Like no, like Kendrick Brothers movie is not going to lead to merchandise sales in Walmarts, right? It's just, and it's nothing against Kendrick Brothers. I think they're really solid Christian guys, for the most part, and I don't think they're reformed, but they're, you know, I believe they're consistently evangelical and they really care about what they want, and they know their movies are sermons. They'll tell you that at film festivals, and so but they have their calling, and but there's so much more variety of storytelling that Christians can do that is not Kendrick Brothers, it's not Pure Flix, it's not Angel biopics or stuff like that. There, which is Mormon. That's not even really Christian, but you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
just the whole faith-based sort of stuff that we have. Um, and so I think what it's going to take is one, it's going to take investors who are not cowards. That's we've we being in the investment world, the Christian investment world, I've noticed that people sort of use the word wisdom as a way to cover their lack of courage. They say, "Oh, well, we should have wisdom in anything we invest in," which is true. You absolutely should.
Hmm.
You should do wisdom, but wisdom is usually a word that means I'm highly risk averse.
Yeah.
Right? And we forget, the parable of the talents is a great example of this, where, you have the guy who buried his talents in the sand and Jesus cast him off into hell because he, didn't get a return on the investment. Right.
Yeah.
And so, there's obviously a spiritual, uh, message there for sure, but you can't have a parable unless the temporal message is also true, or else it doesn't make sense. So that looking at it from a temporal standpoint, the principle is that God doesn't like it when people don't reinvest their money that they've been given because they're cowards.
Yeah.
That's absolute fact. And and the other thing is, like, you look at it too, and Jesus said, I could have made more money by just put it in the bank off of interest, right? And and we look at that and go, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea." And we don't think that Jesus was kind of using that as an insult, right? He wasn't like complimenting the banking system of interest there. He was alluding to the fact that you're worse than the banks, but it doesn't mean that your investment strategy should be the bank.
Yeah. No,
And
and
that's what boomers have done, you know.
I think there's a level of, I think what we're seeing in our culture of Christians is they bemoan the lack of institutional weightiness of Christianity, the lack of Christian culture, but then people who try to make it, they they
They don't
they
respect.
they use
Yeah,
wisdom. They say wisdom, oh, this is foolish endeavor, like it's not going to
yeah,
work, and it's like, yeah, it won't work if we don't
yeah.
work on it, right?
Yeah.
But
This is it's true throughout all of time that the more culture an investment produces, the more valuable the investment,
yep.
the return. So a great example of this is probably the most uh obvious example for when we talk about investment, um is I Christians love to invest in real estate. Real estate is a massive Christian investment play. Most all conservatives and faith-based guys are doing massive uh, investment strategies. Now, you can flip a house. You got about 90 days. You buy the house, you flip it, do the construction, sell it. 90 days. And you're going to bless a family, maybe another generation, maybe two generations will reap the rewards of that quick 90-day investment. Or you can redevelop an entire downtown district, right? So there's developers that come in and they just demolish the abandoned buildings, they put in apartments and restaurants, and suddenly you have a an area in town that's the centerpiece for arts and culture and food and music and all this sort of stuff in a downtown district that was originally abandoned buildings. And that's a 10 to 20 year play. It's not a 90-day turnaround on a
Yep.
house, but that 10 to 20-year play is going to become the centerpiece for that entire community and be the focal point of all arts and culture. And then from there, now all of a sudden, those buildings are insanely valuable over time, and they become, landmarks in the city and historical pieces, buildings, and all this sort of stuff. But that's a short-term play versus a long-term play. So whenever we're talking about, hey, we're going to invest in something that's going to be a cultural institution, that is, you're not going to get your return immediately. You will get it. It is possible to get a return on those investments while you're still alive, and you should have not invest in something that says, yeah, well, maybe this will make a return in 200 years. Like that's not, I wouldn't invest in anything like that. But there's a difference between I'm going to invest in this house and get a return in 90 days, and I'm going to invest in this thing that's maybe 10 to 20 years out.
Yeah.
And we should be investing in those 10 to 20 years out things. But that's not what you expect to see in, let's say, a Silicon Valley venture capital startup. Most all the venture capital startup stuff that conservatives do are B2B SaaS, which is subscription as a
Yep.
service for like businesses. And the goal of those is to build a company, get maybe like 5 to 10 subscribers that are paying 20 grand a month. So you're bringing in $1 million in revenue a year, and then just sell that to Google, sell that to Amazon, or sell it to some other company, get the return within 2 years, maybe at the most. And that's conservative investment when it comes to tech. But again, nothing is remembered. Nobody knows what those B2B SaaSes are. They're just integrated into other things that are bigger and create more culture than you do.
Yep.
And so that's the challenge, is just convincing conservatives you've got to stop your addiction to quick real estate plays and focus on more longer term investments, especially in the technology world and the entertainment and art world. Like that is, people think I'm crazy talking about this, but it's just demonstrably true, and it's very simple. It's not hard to understand at all, but you know, there's a reason why in Revelation, homosexuals go to hell, and right after homosexuals, it lists cowards, right? So, and I think a lot of that is because we don't get this. We we don't build anything. Cowards don't build empires, right? Like it's just not what happens. And so the being risk averse is not a virtue. It's
Yep.
it's not a virtue. I was reading something about Elon Musk, some of the founders that worked with Elon Musk early in the early days of PayPal. Um, and they said that Elon Musk didn't have a category for risk. He just did, like it's not in his head. And they said if he did have a metric in which he used to measure risk, nobody knows what it is, right? And so now you look at Elon Musk and he's seen as this brave, courageous entrepreneur who's built these new technologies and stuff that Christians would never back. If an unknown Elon Musk came to Christians and said, "Hey, I want to build these spaceships, and the plan is to go to Mars, and we want to colonize Mars, and we want to, make reusable rockets." Uh, I've had Christians tell me that what Elon Musk is doing is ridiculous because man's dominion is only limited to Earth in the Bible, and it's just like you you understand, like just 2 days ago, Elon Musk said the first ships to Mars are going out in 2 years at the first Mars window. In 4 years, the first manned people to Mars he's planning to send out. Like that's so incomprehensible to me that it's only 4 years away that we're going to attempt that. And then in 20 years, he plans that there's going to be colonies on Mars within 20 years. And, Rod Martin, who's on our advisory board, he was on the founding team of PayPal. He said, "Look, man, I've known Elon, and if Elon says that he's going to colonize Mars, we need to start thinking about church planting on Mars." And he's like dead serious about it, right? Like that's like dead serious.
Yeah.
If he says he's going to do it, he's most likely going to do it. And if he's consumed with the idea, it's most likely going to happen. And meanwhile, Christians are like, "Ah, well, we're going to keep doing our little faith-based movies."
Yeah. And I feel like guys like
Like,
Elon
what is
Musk,
going on?
and I feel like guys like Elon Musk or even like Mormon evangelism, whatever it is, there is these people outside of the faith that seem more bold for their vision than we are for the Christian gospel and just even glorifying God in general. So Marcus, really appreciate having you on. Love your zeal for Christian art. That doesn't have to be explicitly preachy, but it's just good art that changes culture. So
Yeah. Let me just encourage everybody to go to LOOR.tv. If you go to LOOR.tv, subscribe and get a free 7-day trial. And with that 7-day trial, you can start funding content. And right now, Barely Biblical has got a $10,000 match on it. So anybody who gives $1 to Barely Biblical is getting $3 in return. Funded towards the artist is getting $3 in return towards funding the show. And we're about to fund the second episode, which is on Ehud and Eglon. And if you want to see violent Old Testament Bible stories reenacted by teddy bears, that is the way to do it. And so yeah, subscribe to Lore TV and just start funding content. Just start showing people that there really is a market for content that isn't feminized.
yeah. Well, Marcus, thanks for having joining us on the show, and we really appreciate it. And we'll be keeping an eye out on Lore TV and what they do.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Seated here at my right hand, the Lord to my Lord did command, for of these heathen I will make a kingly footstool for your sake. The